The importance of infrastructure development at the African Union Summit taking place in Addis Ababa in Ethiopia. The AU heads of state session will start on Sunday. South Africa has been at the helm of the AU's Presidential Infrastructure Champion initiative, which is aimed at promoting priority development projects. For more on this, we cross to our correspondent in Addis Ababa, Sarah Kimani. Thanks very much, Sarah, for joining us. So what's happening where you are?
Well, today meetings of various ministers continue, and one of the main meetings that will also be happening today is a meeting to discuss how far the implementation of the African Continental Free Trade Area has taken place, which is very important because it's already been ratified by enough members, and so it is taken effect, and it means that now African countries can begin trading together freely, they can open their borders, but before that happens, there are steps that must be put in place, and these are the steps that I now want to discuss with Minister Jackson Mthembu, who joins me live. Tell me, Minister, so we are here, and one of the issues that you will be discussing is the African Continental Free Trade Area and its implementation. Where does the continent stand now?
We are quite confident that indeed we will reach agreements on even the tricky issues that were involved in these discussions. One of them, the items that will serve as trading items. How do you then say that they are originally from Africa? So that was one tricky issue. At least there has been some tentative agreement that at least if such a product, 40% production is made in Africa, we can say indeed that product originates from Africa, because as you will know, many products, including cars originate from many countries. You find one part coming from this country, another part coming from this country. So that was one tricky issue, but we think it is now being resolved. We are happy that we will see the actual implementation of the African Free Trade Area coming into effect very soon. There are agreements now between all member states in the African continent.
Because when you talk about issues of manufacturing, one of the pillars of Agenda 2063, and also the reason why there is the encouragement of the implementation of the African Continental Free Trade Area is because the continent does not manufacture a lot.
True.
So how will then this trade agreement help us to be more manufacturers and not just consumers?
Definitely, that's why we must work very close with our agencies that provide funding, because we can't say, as the Africa Agenda 2063 says, we are self-sufficient when we get everything else from other continents and other countries in other continents. So we must now start as the African continent, and we are then happy that in our Agenda 2063 says we must start being self-sufficient. We must ensure that we have got funding mechanisms that are embedded in our African cultural traditions, so that we are not again, we suffer this colonization by other countries and other continents. So the Africa Agenda 2063 goes a long way. For instance, we are already speaking of all the infrastructure programs in the continent. Whether you talk of Brazzaville, you talk of Algeria, you talk of Egypt, or you talk of South Africa, we have already, as Africa, agreed that we must roll out infrastructure. You can't have an African free trade area when you don't have road infrastructure that takes you there. Secondly, rail infrastructure that takes you there. So our leaders in the African continent have agreed that we must do justice to the presidential championship initiative of infrastructure building in the continent, which we have started to do. You know that we have started in South Africa. We have been given by the AU to produce rail stock for the entire African continent, which we have started, the Gibela initiative in the East Rand. Secondly, we have been asked by the AU to produce more water from the Lesotho highlands and cooperate with Lesotho so that we get the water from the Lesotho highlands, a water project, and Lesotho generate electricity. So there are those matters, synergies that we are then emphasizing and maximizing between countries of Africa. Again, with the DRC, we are saying the Inga Dam should be critical in ensuring electricity sufficiency, not only in South Africa but also in the region. We have now just heard that a lot of gas has been found in Mozambique. We also want to capitalize on that gas in Mozambique so that it doesn't only serve SADC, but it also serves the entire continent of Africa. So we're very happy that all these discussions are finding concrete expression in Africa, working together to maximize economies of scale in the African continent.
When you speak to the other leaders from the other countries, do you feel there's a sense of political will for countries to open their borders? Do they accept and agree that it is important that Africa trades more with itself?
Definitely. In fact, that is the essence of the African Free Trade Agreement, that indeed Africa, before we can even look for trade with others, as you will know, we are trading more with other people outside of Africa than with ourselves. So all leaders in the African continent agree that the African trade model assists Africa to ensure intra-trade. So we will start trading more with ourselves, but also the good part is that we will also capitalize on what are the best things we can offer as countries in the African free trade area. What is our competitive advantage? What is the competitive advantage of Cote d'Ivoire? What is the competitive advantage of South Africa? Competitive advantage of Ghana, Egypt, and Ethiopia, so that we then use those competitive advantages as means through which we can then trade as the African continent. Yes, the African leaders are in agreement that it's high time we trade amongst ourselves and we increase the economic development of our continent and of our various regions and our various national countries.
And finally, one of the issues that you will be discussing, and actually the main theme of this conference, is silencing the guns.
True.
Will you be taking the competitive advantage of young people who are at the moment being taken advantage of by extremist groups? And that is why you find Burkina Faso, Somalia, Kenya, Mali, all these areas are affected by violent extremism. How will you then be discussing the youth and how you can bring them on board so that then violence can reduce and economies can grow?
You know, Agenda 2063, one of the aspirations is skilling our young people. That is a very important aspiration arising from the principles that gave rise to the African Union. So you are correct. We must get our young people skilled throughout the continent. We must get our young people to schools, not to army barracks. So there is that agreement. But you'll also know that there has been a lot of work that the continental leaders have done to silence the guns in Africa. In fact, there are few areas now that we are dealing with, as you will know, Sudan and Libya. When we're looking at 10 years ago, we'll be looking at many countries in Africa engaged in wars. So even these wars in Africa have abated because of the stance that the African Union has taken, that we must deal with our problems through political dialogue, not through guns. Yes, silencing the guns is still an important theme, but you can only silence the guns by ensuring economic prosperity in the entirety of the continent. That's what our leaders will be discussing. How do we ensure that there is economic prosperity in the continent, prosperity that gives rise to jobs for our young ones, so that they are not attracted to the militia groups.
Thank you very much. Earlier, we spoke to the former chairperson of the African Union, Dr. Nkosazana Dlamini Zuma, and she alluded to the same thing that the minister is saying, that unless the continent takes advantage of its youth population and takes them and wins them over from the violent extremist groups, then it will be impossible for the continent to silence the guns. And that is the theme of this year's African Union, silencing the guns to create a conducive environment for development on the continent. Back to you in studio.
Thanks very much, Sarah, for your report.